Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Matt Taglia, the Senior Director of Emerson College Polling. Matt, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me again, Brittany.
Emerson College Polling has an end-of-year survey, and this is really taking the temperature of how people feel about 2025 in general, as well as a look in the future and how people are feeling about 2026, and even how they're starting to feel about 2028. And I first want to start with President Trump, and then we can go from there, because there's a graph that this poll has of President Trump's approval versus disapproval rating from the entire year. And it really looks like a full X, right? It completely flipped from where he was January versus where he is right now in terms of his approval versus disapproval. Talk to us about it.
Yeah, Brittany, you're exactly right. It has completely flipped since January. You look at his approval now, and it is 41% approve, 50% disapprove. So this is his worst approval rating yet in our polling. Among independents, he is 45% approve, 55% disapprove. These are not very good numbers for President Trump. We see a little bit further on in the poll as we test some of his policy areas that he's not receiving high marks for these policies. This is not a great end to 2025 for President Trump and the administration.
I'm curious, obviously some people are moving from approving President Trump at the beginning of 2025, closing out the year, to disapproving. Who are those people?
Yeah, Brittany. So as I mentioned, 45% of independents now approve versus 55% disapprove. That is not a very good number among independents. You don't want to see that if you're the president. But I think the more alarming number here is the number of Republicans who approve currently. It's 79%, and that sounds really high. And it is really high, but it's not as high as it was at the start of the year. Then Republicans were in the 90s as far as approving of President Trump. So there are obviously some Republicans here who are sort of on the sidelines. They're saying that they don't necessarily fully disapprove, but they're not willing to say that Trump has their full approval right now.
And obviously, when it comes to an approval rating, that comes down to how people feel President Trump is, or any president for that matter, how they are at handling certain issues. And you asked voters to grade President Trump on how he handles certain issues, his policies behind them, from an A to an F. So, I mean, to start off that conversation, would this be a report card that a kid would be happy to bring home to mom and dad?
Brittany, I don't think it would be one to stick on the refrigerator. So let's start with the highlights for President Trump. Immigration, that is his top issue. It has been throughout the course of the year. We have seen that pretty consistently, that he receives his highest approval on immigration. So here he receives 37% A versus 36% who say it's an F grade. Now, we'll dive a little bit deeper into those numbers. We see that 66% of Republicans give President Trump an A for immigration. So that's a pretty high number. I think that is something that he would be happy to see. Now, moving on to some of these other issues, the economy, 22% give him an A. Affordability, 17% give him an A. Healthcare, 14% give President Trump an A for healthcare versus 38% who give him an F. That is a dire number. And frankly, I think that this is a bit of maybe not sleeper issue, but it's an issue that has gotten a little bit less attention. It is now, with some of the potential provisions of the ACA expiring, some of those COVID era subsidies. So that is now a little bit, that is more top of mind for folks right now, but it hasn't been throughout the course of the year. So that could be a major factor heading into 2026. Healthcare, affordability, that is a tough one. And even among Republicans, just 34% give President Trump an A on affordability. So these issues we see, he is not receiving high marks, and it's something that should be deeply worrying both to the administration and Republicans who are up for re-election.
And I have the graph right in front of me, and the visual is stunning, right? Because the A is a dark green, the F is bright red, just like a teacher's pen. And the red chunks in this graph, the Fs, are a lot bigger than the A, even the B, the C, and the D. So What are the top issues facing voters? Because it's a lot of these issues, right? It's always the economy, immigration, things like that. What are they at the end of 2025?
And at the end of 2025, it looks similar to what it did at the start of 2025. The economy is still the top issue for folks, 38%. Threats to democracy, healthcare, and immigration, all now at 14%. Now, going back to the report card, this is the highest we've seen for healthcare in 2025, 14%. I think that combined with about 40% of folks who say that their finances are worse now than they were a year ago. These secondary issues, the economy, affordability, these things are going to be top of mind. These are things that folks are feeling the squeeze on. And I think that healthcare is now adding on to that now that folks see their potential bills being higher in 2026.
And you asked voters, aside from President Trump, the favorability of other political leaders, everyone from J.D. Vance, the vice president, to Zohran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York City. How are people feeling about other political leaders who aren't named Donald Trump?
Yeah, and I think the overall vibe in these favorabilities is that no one is all that popular. So we'll start with one of the highlights here, I think. J.D. Vance, 46% favorable versus 41% unfavorable. Let's look at Elon Musk. So he's another one who has really high name ID, so people know who he is. He's at 40% favorable versus 46% unfavorable. I think that number would have been higher at the start of the year, his favorability number. But as we saw Doge and some of Elon's other activities over the course of the year, I think his reputation has taken a hit. Some of these other names on the list just aren't as well known. So Mike Johnson, 35% favorable, 38% unfavorable. Josh Shapiro, again, he's a bit of a bright spot, 33% favorable versus 27% unfavorable. But a lot of folks there either don't know who he is or don't have a high opinion of him. If we look at some of the progressives in this, AOC, 32% favorable, 44% unfavorable. That's pretty poor. I would not like to see that if I were AOC or most progressives, frankly. And then Mamdani, another progressive, 26% favorable versus 42% unfavorable. Those are some tough numbers for the progressives there. So really, no one is safe from the wrath of voters here. There are only a few names that receive positive favorability, and these progressive candidates, especially, they're seeing the brunt of unfavorables.
And I think something in common when it comes to this poll is no one from progressive to MAGA has numbers at all in the favorability department that they could exactly write home about. But before we look to the future, I do want to talk about a news story that the Trump administration has been receiving scrutiny over, and that is those controversial boat strikes in the Pacific and Caribbean. And since September, the United States military has struck over 25 vessels, and these attacks have killed over 90 people so far. And the Trump administration has said that these strikes are part of a campaign against drug trafficking, and everyone that has been killed in these attacks that are on those boats are narco-terrorists. Others are questioning the legality of these strikes, and some are even questioning if these were war crimes or if one of the strikes in particular, that double tap strike at least, was a war crime. What do the American people think about these boat strikes?
Yeah, and first, we just wanted to know and establish how many folks were actually paying attention to these boat strikes, whether this had really broken through with the public. And we found that a majority, 59%, had heard a lot about the boat strikes off the coast of South America. So we then followed that up. Anyone who said that they had heard at least some about the boat strikes, we asked whether or not it was justified in their view. So 45% say that these strikes were justified versus 42% who say that they were not justified. So there's a bit of a split there, but overall we see that by about 3 points, folks tend to believe that these were justified. Now, there is, of course, a partisan split here, as you expect with a lot of these things. Majorities of Democrats and independents say that the strikes were not justified versus majority of Republicans who say that they were. So again, there is quite a split here, and it is very much lined up with partisanship. But overall, folks do say that the strikes were justified.
And so then let's look at the future for just a little bit. Let's start with 2026. If you can believe it, we are less than a year away from the midterms. Who's better positioned for those elections, Democrats or Republicans?
And Brittany, Democrats right now are better positioned. So right now we have them at 44% in the generic congressional ballot versus 42% for Republicans, with 15% undecided. Now, I will say I am a little bit surprised that it's not higher for Democrats in this, given that this was such a poor result for President Trump in his approval ratings and his grades. I would have expected that for that to translate to more success for Democrats on that generic congressional ballot, but we just aren't seeing it quite yet. I think that next year we're going to start moving into a likely voter universe. And so things will change a little bit, and that might end up boosting Democrats a little bit in that generic ballot. Right now, I think the one highlight is that independents are breaking for Democrats by 40% to 32% for Republicans. But right now, we are not seeing that movement towards Democrats like we even saw in 2025 elections. But I do think that that will probably pick up steam as we head into 2026.
And when you're looking at undecideds, I know that we're just about a year away, but how many are there, and does that really matter just yet?
Yeah, they're 15%, and I do think that that's reasonably high. Even though we have a year to go, I think that folks mostly know who they're leaning towards supporting. Even now, just given how much partisanship matters at this point in U.S. politics. But yeah, so I think that they definitely matter, and I think that there's a lot of runway here. But I think that as we get into the campaign cycle, we're going to see some of these folks breaking. And again, we are going to be moving to a likely voter universe, and that will change this. And I think it'll naturally bring down some of that undecided factor.
And now let's look at 2028, because you asked voters a really interesting question: what type of candidate they would hypothetically support in the next presidential election. And you divided it in four camps: a progressive Democrat candidate, a moderate Democrat, a MAGA Republican, or a moderate Republican. And you found that by and large, voters mostly want a more moderate candidate. Talk to us about what you found.
Yeah, Brittany. So we matched these hypothetical presidential candidates together to see on the ideology spectrum who would do better. So the first matchup is a progressive Democrat versus a MAGA Republican. And we see that they're very close to tied. So 43% for the progressive candidate versus 42% for the MAGA Republican. We next tried a progressive Democrat versus a moderate Republican. And we find that a progressive does significantly worse than a moderate Republican, 36% versus 48%. A moderate Democrat, 47% versus a MAGA Republican, 38%. And then a moderate Democrat versus a moderate Republican. That is a little bit interesting. There we see 39% break for the Democrat versus 44% for the Republican. So as you said, moderates fare better here. And I think that that does come down to folks believing that they are more moderate than they might not necessarily be. And the just general appeal of wanting to support someone who's a little bit more towards the center, who wants to work across the aisle. But I think that this would change pretty significantly once we attach names to these candidates. And I think that it will change significantly once we get to 2028 and some of these candidates do have names. But it is interesting to see, and moderates certainly seem to fare better. And that is largely driven by independent voters here.
And then when you look at everything that happened this year, some good, some bad, there was certainly a lot of news. I mean, the news cycle was moving so fast this year. When people reflect on 2025 and they're looking ahead towards 2026, do they think that next year is going to be better than this past one?
So the good news is they do. 52%, so a slim majority say that they think 2026 will be better than 2025. I think that that's good news for everyone. It seems like folks are not in a very happy mood at the end of 2025. There have been some issues that have continued throughout the course of the year. We've not seen them drop on our issues testing or as you saw in Trump's grades. You know, folks don't necessarily feel great about the year, but they're positive about the year ahead. And that's especially true of folks who are under the age of 30. 69% of those voters say that 2026 is going to be better than 2025. I'm right with them. Hopefully that's true.
Well, I love that. I mean, I'm glad that people are ending this year at least on a more optimistic note. And Matt Taglia, thank you for joining me all throughout this year to talk to us about the numbers, break down Emerson's polls. I appreciate it, and hopefully we can have many more next year.
Yep. Thank you, Brittany. See you in 2026.